Okay, hi everyone. This is Andrea Powell with Karana Rising, and this is our first episode of Surviving Now. Karana Rising has been in existence for 2 years, and we are a collective of survivors of human trafficking and sexual assault. We're based here in Washington, D.C., but like many people who are working remotely, working virtually, we are becoming more and more a global community of survivors and advocates and allies from around the world. And the reason for Surviving Now is we are seeking to create a space where survivors are not only talking about their survivorhood, but are actually able to contribute to pressing issues, current events, and critical human rights concerns, both here in the United States and internationally. So today we are going to be speaking about the incarceration and the treatment of individuals who are survivors of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, who have experienced arrest or incarceration. Just last week, Alexis Martin, who was charged with the murder of her trafficker at the age of 15, was granted release by the state of Ohio, in large part due to concerns about the coronavirus and what's happening to inmates across the country as a result of the risk of coronavirus. So Alexis's release prompted us at Karana Rising to want to speak about the fact that we are celebrating her release, but we're also concerned about the way that survivors who are still in jail, survivors who've experienced arrest, are living their lives during these times. I also wanted to point out that just last night, there was a large bust of over 30 men in the DC area who were attempting to solicit minors and engage in sex with minors. So those individuals demonstrate for us that we actually have a large issue with trafficking across the country. And so while we're talking today about survivors and survivor justice, this issue is still ongoing, and it's still something that is facing young people and victims across the country, both in and out of jail, those who are survivors and those who are at risk. So with that being said, I want to open up by asking Asia to tell us a little bit about herself. She's one of our guests, Asia Kyle, who is our advocacy lab leader, and I'll let her take it from there, and then we'll move on to our next guest.
Hi, I'm Asia. Like Andrea just said, I'm the advocacy lab leader. I've been a survivor for about 11 years, and currently I'm a mom and a licensed cosmetologist, and I'm definitely a survivor. I'm just here to help like the next person, like be free and stay free. That's it.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Lee Satterfield. Lee, I'm going to let you do your own introduction, so I think it would be really great. So I'll let you kind of share a little bit about yourself.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Lee Satterfield, and I'm a member of the board of directors of the organization. In my professional life, I've served as a prosecutor in the District of Columbia for 4 years, where I prosecuted crimes of domestic violence, sexual assault, and murder. Since 1982, I've served as a judge on the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, where I presided over our domestic violence division, our family court, and served as chief judge for 8 years. I'm currently in what we call senior status, where I just work part-time but maintain my judicial powers.
Excellent, Lee. Thank you so much. I also wanted to kind of contextualize a little bit here that predominantly today we're going to be talking about survivors who were either arrested or incarcerated as minors, but many survivors are also arrested as adults, and we're advocating for and are committed to justice for all survivors, be they minors or adults, during the time of their trafficking or during the time of their arrest or incarceration. With that said, Lee, what do you believe should or could have been done differently to lead to a better outcome for Alexis Martin, who was, as I mentioned, 15 when she was charged with the murder of her trafficker and had been a trafficking victim for quite some time as a minor?
You know, while I'm not as familiar with the law in Ohio, the first thing that struck me was that she was charged as an adult and not in their juvenile court or family court. where the judges have much more discretion in how they treat cases. So that's where I thought the case began the road toward her later guilty plea, and then at sentencing, she was as dealt no mitigating factors, and just, in my opinion, were considered. So I think the way she was charged really was the biggest thing in that case.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Lee. And how we look at trafficking victims, particularly young women of color, and how we view their culpability, how we view them in the broader context of the criminal justice system. Asia, as a survivor and someone who now works with survivors, both who've experienced being arrested, in some cases incarcerated as a result of their trafficking, what are some key facts that you think listeners should know about when it comes to being arrested as a survivor? How does it impact a survivor's sense of self?
It will make the survivor feel as if they can't trust anybody. They can't trust the trafficker, and then they can't trust law enforcement. So you're in a spot where it's like, you're alone, what do I do? So if you can't trust law enforcement, you're gonna do what's more familiar, more than likely. It also can impact you as far as, like, nobody believes you, nobody's listening to you. It makes you feel like alone or stuck, and you don't know, like, if you're ever going to get out of this. In one of my situations, like, the officer actually seemed like he was kind of in on it, so that was kind of scary. He personally drove me in his vehicle and asked me questions, and it didn't matter that I told him, like, I was from a different city and that I was young. Like, it didn't matter to him.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to understand, like, there are practical considerations around those arrests and how it impacts your life, but it's also that emotional sense of who do you trust, who do you connect to. Lee, I've talked to you a little bit about this, and actually anyone who gets near me or anyone at Karana Rising has now heard of Tiffany Simpson. Tiffany Simpson is in the state of Georgia. She is serving a 20-year sentence, was arrested also as a minor at the age of 17 after her trafficker, who had stabbed her and brutalized her, impregnated her and attempted to murder her more than once, and also threatened to set her grandmother's house on fire. After all that, he decided he wanted to make more money and used her Facebook account to lure a 13-year-old girl into the trafficking situation. When he was arrested, Tiffany was also arrested and charged with 20 years. She's been awaiting a court date, and we've been working with her for quite some years now on a campaign to free Tiffany Simpson. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think should be done now in the courts? And I know you're in the District of Columbia, so I'm happy for you to contextualize it in that framework if needed. But what should be done now in the courts to help survivors like Tiffany who are still waiting for their justice? What should that look like?
Well, education is always very important. Education as to, just like we educated judges nationwide about victims of domestic violence, so they can understand the victim mentality and why victims do certain things when they are abused by their abusers. So education is first important with the judges, and we do that a lot with respect to domestic violence nation. But then again, you have to do it with the law enforcement too, and prosecutors particularly, because they have wide discretion in how they charge individuals and decisions they make, as well as the judge, who has wide discretion in terms of how a person is sentenced. And I'd say, in my opinion, these charges and these sentences are pretty disturbing, given the mitigating factors that are involved in the age of the people that have been victimized that are coming into the system. And so you have to start with education, getting folks to focus on that. And you have to go to legislatures so that laws can be created that take into it, which require the judge to take into account these mitigating factors. Now the judges have the discretion to take it into account. And I think we do that here in the district and so forth. We don't, as far as I know, have these types of disturbing outcomes when it comes to victims of sexual trafficking.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's good to know. And we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the historical context of some of these cases. Asia, so we talked about that sense of self and from your perspective as a survivor and as an advocate, what it does to your sense of trust and your kind of your inner world to experience that arrest. But I wanted to shift a little bit to the more practical implications of arrest for survivors. What are some of the daily experiences, you know, kind of outside and in the world that you've seen either for yourself or for others, and those practical implications?
I've seen like applying for a job. My past came back to haunt me. 8 years later, when it's like my whole life completely changed. So I wasn't able to get my pharmacy technician license. So that was huge because all I wanted was to prove to myself that I'm capable of finishing something and, you know, getting a degree or diploma. So that was one of the biggest things. Another thing is kind of going to the doctor. You know, you experience things as being like a victim. And so when you're a survivor, you still have to go to the doctor. You never know if something can come back from the past. So you're just always like, it's always within you. So daily life, a regular doctor's appointment can turn into, oh, this came from 5 years ago. So you're definitely impacted. Like if you want to get married or have a kid, you know, later in life, it's just things come up from the past and you're not thinking that because you're a survivor. You're living a normal life like everybody else. But there's always a small reminder in the daily world that, yeah, this happened to you. So.
And Asia, how do you know, what are some things that have helped you kind of navigate both those emotions, but also some of those practical implications of experiencing that arrest? I mean, this is sort of a free form question, but
right.
I've known you for a long time. I know you have a lot.
Yeah, right. I think like the art therapy program that we used to do definitely helped. Like being around survivors who have overcome these situations and who don't consider themselves a victim is kind of like when they say you are who you surround yourself with. Yoga, good music. I learned to explore the city like of DC, like finding like fun things to do, like go to the zoo, take a walk. It's just like self-care, even trying to eat better, like all those things. Like it's like a lifestyle. You just have to have a lifestyle. Yeah, and I'm like more on guard about things. Like I have a child, so you just think about things more than you did. You know, you want to prevent it from happening to your child or any other young girl you know. So.
I think that's really insightful, Asia. In addition to being a survivor, a mom, a licensed cosmetologist, an advocate, an artist, basically you do a lot. You get around. You know, you talked a little bit about some of those self-care tips. What would you say to someone, be it a survivor or just someone who's struggling right now with the real impact of this pandemic? I mean, right now, as we record our first episode, we have a global pandemic and many people are struggling to keep food on the table, to stay sane. And we have experts talking very statistically about unemployment.
Right.
People who are experiencing these challenges aren't really being given that platform. So what do you say to them?
So I used to tell people to trust the process because people would tell me that. But given like the coronavirus is not, we don't know what's going to happen next. So there's no process aligned for us to follow. You kind of have to like go with the flow and like be strong enough to actually like use the resources. Like if they have free food banks, because even for myself, it's like a challenge. Like, oh, I have to go stand in line. I have to find a sitter. But utilize the things in the city that we have. And like, also like when you have resources, share it with the next person. Like this is a time where like we really need each other and you should work together. So.
I appreciate that. Lee, you have been with DC courts for more than 20 years and just have this wealth of knowledge. You know, you and I met in an apartment building we both lived in, and we got to know each other that way, and then come to find out we were both involved in the court system in different ways, myself as an advocate and you as a judge. And I have just so much respect for the history and the work that you've done. But I wanted to ask you, in the past 20 years, from your experience, how have you seen the courts change their views on the issue of human trafficking, particularly as it relates to minors, as well as, you know, how the criminal justice system is or should be treating these young people?
I've seen the views change tremendously in the last 20 years regarding domestic violence. And so we have more domestic violence courts and things of that nature. But in terms of human sex trafficking, it just started to do in the last few years, where, as you know, we have the Hope Court and the Superior Court that tries to empower and focus on young women or juveniles who that are involved in victims of sex trafficking. And we've had task force here in the district. The court had a task force during the time I was chief judge. I'm not sure if they still are working it, but I know that Mayor Bowser has taken on that issue here in the district. So I think it's starting to change more now. We're way ahead when it comes to domestic violence. We need to get the same type of movement as they have with domestic violence with respect to this area too.
Well, and I'd like to give a little bit of a historical context for those listeners and viewers, be it now or later, who maybe need to know a little bit about what the Hope Court program is. And I come to that conversation as an advocate, not someone who's a lawyer or prosecutor or probation officer. But Hope Court was really the brainchild of a judge in DC court, Judge Mary Rook, who I didn't dare ask to join this call because I think I just get a solid no out of that because of her position. But I wanted to say that, you know, the Hope Court is really designed to be a collaborative of advocates, case managers, service organizations, probation officers, you know, prosecutors from the Office of Attorney General to come together for specific individual cases of minors who are either suspected of being or confirmed of being involved in commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. So commercial sexual exploitation is just a quick explainer. Commercial sexual exploitation may not always involve a pimp or a trafficker. It might be a young person who is engaging in commercial sex to try to survive and make ends meet. But the bottom line is, on the other side of that story, what's often called survival sex, is someone who's exploiting that minor's needs, and there's never a scenario in which an adult should be engaging in that behavior. It's not helping the minor, it's exploiting them. So that's commercial sexual exploitation, whereas sex trafficking has that triangle of the trafficker, the buyer who's benefiting, and that child or that adult who was forced, frauded, or coerced into that situation. I'm not going to turn this into a trafficking 101, but I think it's helpful to know. So Hope Court was designed to reach these young people and offer them a chance to get therapeutic intervention, potentially and likely have their cases adjudicated, but also to reshape the court system so that we reach kids before they become in situations like Tiffany Simpson or Alexis Martin or Centoya Brown. For those of you who haven't read Centoya Brown's new book, I highly encourage that you get that book and read it. She talks in great detail about all the systems that failed her, social service systems, foster parents, probation officers. There were a lot of red flags that she was involved in trafficking situations and being exploited, and those were either not picked up or ignored, or she was pushed to the side the way that Alexis Martin was, Hope Zefferjohn, Tiffany Simpson. All of these girls' stories, and side note again, also this can happen to boys, and it in fact does on a big level, but you know, all of these young women were once young girls in the court systems who were routinely, you know, overlooked. Asia, you know, Alexis Martin is now being released. Centoya Brown has been free since August of this past year. Why should the public care about the release of someone like Tiffany Simpson or Hope Jefferson or so many others? Like, why should people look at this as something that they should be involved with or care about?
I feel like if they see that the survivors are actually being released, then it should tell them that, you know, they're innocent. And so the next person that goes in for the same reason, like, I think they shouldn't even make it into the jail. I mean, like, we should have protesters and things like that. It should show people like this is big. This is they shouldn't be in jail. So for them to see like 2 and 3 people getting released, I think the community can help like see signs and see signs if there is somebody maybe being trafficked. Let's say the malls open back up or at a restaurant, like they can help prevent it in whatever way, if there's a text message to law enforcement or like a mandated reporter or anything like that.
Well, and I think you're hitting on a key point, is maybe not intentionally, but a lot of people don't know about these cases. You know, they might see a news article of a trafficking bust, and think, okay, you know, all the bad guys were caught and put in jail and all the good guys were rescued and saved. And oftentimes when we're reading the articles and we see, you know, all these young women who are being arrested as part of the trafficking network, now that I know about Centoya Brown and have a personal relationship with Tiffany Simpson and Hope Zefferjohn and so many other survivors across the country who've experienced arrest, I look at those articles pretty suspiciously. And you know, just as Lee said, I think we have a pretty phenomenal criminal justice system, as well as some pretty amazing detectives and law enforcement here in the District of Columbia. We also have legislation that keeps minors from being arrested and prosecuted for crimes of solicitation and prostitution. And that safe harbor legislation has been really critical and happening across different states, although it's still a long way to go. But the truth of the matter is, Lee, most of the survivors I've worked with who were minors were not arrested on solicitation and prostitution. They were arrested on other charges: truancy, running away, status offenses. So it can be, you know, not showing up to a court hearing of neglect. So, you know, with that in mind, you know, what are ways that you've seen or that you think you should see other courts being better at identifying these kids as victims, as opposed to just another kid in the system?
First of all, here in the district, it starts with the Attorney General, Karana Rising. His organization really looks at these cases and look at the underlying circumstances. And then when they come to court, for the judges who are trained, but also in the district, we have a social services division that is one of the few divisions that has a girl program, a solidarity leadership program that's designed for these girls. Because as you know, the juvenile justice system was originally designed for boys, and didn't anticipate the number of girls coming in. But if we've seen them over the years, I know here in the district, I think our states should look at designing programs specifically for girls.
I think Asia has a side guest who's joined in temporarily. I'll let her decide. Hi, Aisha.
Go back, okay.
So, you know, this is going to be an interesting shift. Asia, sorry to put you on the spot while your
okay.
co-host is joined in, but this is, everybody's in this together. There's a pandemic, right. We're all home. But I wanted to say, you know, and Lee, you started to touch on this as well. Over 90% of the young women and girls who I've served have been young women of color, vast majority being African-American young women. And I get pushback occasionally from media, from others saying, well, but the District of Columbia, you know, has a very large population of African-Americans, so that's why there's so many young women in your program who are African-American. But an inconvenient fact to counter that statement would be that only 49% of the District of Columbia is African-American, whereas 90% of my clients are. So I don't really see their argument holding a lot of weight. So Asia, my question to you is, do you feel that there is, when it comes to arrest and the way that survivors are looked at by anyone, it doesn't just have to be law enforcement, do you think there's a racial component to that?
I think there's a racial component, and also, like, I don't know if you want to call it social or like class or something, because I know, like, I'm from the Midwest, and I feel like people kind of like help me more based on how I look or how I came across. But there's like, it's other girls that I've seen that, I'm sad to say, maybe darker complected or wear their hair different, or they just like talk different, and they could easily be looked past. So I can say that. Yeah.
And I think it's important to note that, you know, trafficking often happens after a confluence of other challenging issues, homelessness, neglect in the home, struggles in the home, you know, lack of food on the table. There's a lot of risk factors. And right now we have over, you know, 30 million kids out of school, 70% or more maybe at this point of schools are closed across the United States, many for the rest of the year. So you've got a lot of people who are trying to work, trying to put food on the table, trying to provide for their kids. We also have, for example, in the state of New York, or actually, sorry, New York City, 1 in 10 kids is homeless. So we're talking about millions of homeless kids trying to get by, kids who are relying on school lunches. And so I'm bringing this up because you have a lot of vulnerabilities that are kind of pre-existing conditions to make someone at risk toward trafficking. You know, Lee, what are some of the risk factors that you think, you know, judges or those in the court system should be looking for when thinking maybe this young person is at risk or potentially experiencing trafficking?
Well, I think it starts with school and education, truancy. I've always thought truancy was the first indication that something's going wrong. If you get involved with kids when they are truant early on with social workers and getting into the home, you can kind of figure those things out. The goal is to keep them out of the neglect system and the juvenile court system so they don't graduate to the criminal division where these disturbing results could happen. So I think you really need to start. I've been a big advocate of working on truancy in the district and other places because I think that's where we get our first signs.
I think that's really important, and not a lot of people would actually hit on that point of truancy, because, you know, obviously some trafficking victims are going to school during the day. There was a huge case in Fairfax of MS-13 gang-related trafficking where the girls would be picked up by a van right outside the school, right in front of teachers and others. But then when they started missing school is when people started saying, like, there's something different, there's something going on. And that's how that case was uncovered. I won't go into the details, but it was pretty gruesome. But getting back to the core of this conversation and thinking about not only the criminal justice system, but how we as a society look at young women differently in the court system, because you hit on that, Lee, and Asia, you as well. You know, what has struck me over and over again is there is a very harsh attitude toward young women who are considered to be committing a violent offense. There's a very different take on it, you know, in terms of like, well, she was crazy, or she should have known better. How could she do that to another person? Whereas, you know, you see a lot in the media with like, well, he had a bad home life, he had mental health issues, you know, it's sort of the like person gets shot by bullet, not person is shot by other person sort of mentality when it comes to guys, whereas women, you know, experience it differently. And, you know, Lee, have you seen, you know, shifts in those attitudes and how young women are treated in the courts when they're coming in for more violent offenses?
I only can speak about the district. I know that we look at that, and that's consideration. We've seen more of that over the years in the past. And so, as I said, we really start with the schools, and we start with our social services division and our juvenile court, where we've seen more girls come in. We had a dynamite social division director focus on the trend of girls coming into court in the juvenile section and created programs designed for girls. You have to say, boys and girls are different, obviously, and they have different types of things that need to be considered in coming up with the best program. You can't treat young girls with a program designed for boys. And so we've done that here in the district. I'm not familiar with a lot of the other states.
I appreciate that. So we have about 10 more minutes. I committed to us stopping at 12:40. 40 minutes is the pumpkin time that Zoom gives you for these conversations. But I wanted to open the floor up. We have several other participants here, and I wanted to see if anyone had their own questions. I could keep rocking and rolling with my own, but I want this to be a space for those to ask questions, and then we'll close with a couple of notes on how folks can stay connected to Karana Rising and Surviving Now and support survivors. So if anyone has any questions, type those into the chat function, if you will, and then I will field those and get those across to our panelists. All right, I'm not seeing anything now, so I'm going to keep going. Asia, you know, you and I have known each other for longer than probably either of us want to admit at this point. So, but a very long time, and you were one of the first people that I got a chance to get to know on a really, you know, personal level. And for me, and I think this is a core belief across Karana Rising, is we're not looking at each other as, well, you've been through this or you've been through that, or, you know, it's more a collaborative feeling, like we've all been through something. And so you know, I think that that's really, you know, critical. What are some things that you've learned about being an advocate and advocating for others that's meaningful for you in the last few years?
I've learned that I was not alone in this, it's just like the coronavirus. It's like, it's other people going through the same thing. So I'm not just singled out and it's just me. So I learned that was one of the biggest things I went away with. And the fact that I knew I wasn't the only one, that means that there is like some type of support or resource. There's a way to get through this.
And Snezhina from Serbia is asking, how is labeling affecting your personality? How do you cope with judgment if you felt judged?
There are many times I felt judged, even by like the tiny people, like few people that I confided in. It will be used against me. Like I will be called a name like 5 years after confiding. Well, this is what I went through or whatever. And I stood up for myself. You know, I held my head high. Just like with the pharmacy technician situation, I was like, well, I know that's not my life anymore. And I just told myself, like, I'm capable. I'm able to do what everybody else can do. It's like self-care, self-talk. Like, you build yourself up and you stay around people that are supportive.
And I think that rings true with some of the words that Tiffany, who is still in jail, were sharing with us. I wish there was some way to get her on a Zoom call, but I am fairly confident that the jail will never allow for anything like that. So Asia and I share her words as best we can through our writing, through supporting her and sharing her blogs online. And you can find a lot of that at our Facebook page, Karana Rising, as well as our Instagram page, which is We Are Karana Rising. And I do want to encourage people, as we release this on YouTube and Spotify, to subscribe and stay connected so we can share Tiffany's words as well as the words of many other survivors on other critical issues. Sylvia has a question. How can those, are there pieces of legislation in DC or federally that help survivors? Are there any current bills? So Lee, I didn't know if you had anything in mind that you wanted to share.
No, I think you're better at focusing on what legislation there is in DC. I just follow the law that they provide us. I think you're better at that. I can't comment on the legislation.
I think Sylvia is trying to tease out the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, reintroduced in January by Senators Portman and Gillibrand. That bill would provide federal vacatur. And as an interesting side note, when that bill was first introduced in 2016, we got a very sharp reaction from our representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who does not like bills that have implications for the District of Columbia. It's a philosophical stance. And so in response to that, we began advocating to pass a DC vacatur bill that vacates the records of nonviolent offenses of trafficking survivors. So that was passed, I believe, 1.5 years ago, which was just an incredible network of advocates, allies, and survivors pushing for that. So we're hopeful for the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act on the federal level, particularly for federal charges. There's a couple of things to note. This bill will come into challenges when we're talking about how to define a violent crime. So someone like Tiffany, who was charged with a crime against a minor, would probably not qualify for a bill like that if she were being looked at on a federal level and charged today. Unfortunately, when she was arrested and charged in Georgia, there was no safe harbor legislation for minors. There was no way for minors to be protected from arrest or prostitution or solicitation, but even that legislation would not necessarily have helped someone like Tiffany because of the nature of the charges she was charged with. So, you know, there have to be multi-layered approaches to not only legislation, but educating judges, educating law enforcement, and educating everyone across the system, and looking again at these cases. So I don't see any other questions coming in. So I want to thank everyone for calling in for our first episode of Surviving Now. And Karana Rising, we're all, as a collective, we're just deeply grateful for people who get involved. I wanted to note that the model, the way that we are looking at this, as well as many of our other content that you'll be seeing online, is we offer a stipend or scholarship, if you will, to survivors who offer their voices, their content, their art, any contribution they make, and that's a $200 stipend. So I'm stating that very simply so there's transparency in our process, but you'll see a link on our YouTube as well as our website to make a contribution. We are trying to raise funds specifically to support survivors as they're surviving not only the pandemic and getting food on their table and getting by, but also ensuring that there's a way for us to stay connected as a collective. So we really consider you all as part of that team. And if there are other ways that you want to support survivors, such as food donations or virtual tutoring for kids, because many of us have kids and could benefit from that, those are ways you can get involved. But thank you, everyone, for working together, for coming together. Lee, I so appreciate your time. I know you're very busy. Asia, we have concrete evidence right now that you are very busy. You don't even have to say it, we see it. And just, thank you, all of you, for joining in, whether you're in Serbia or two doors down from me. We appreciate you, and you'll be seeing this in a link on YouTube and Spotify by the end of the day. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.